Welcome to the Tuesday Club program. My name is Ron Mantegna, and we're glad you're with us today. Dr. Raymond Silverman is a friend and a board-certified psychiatrist. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through a heavy list of credentials that he has. And I'm sure that Dr. Ray won't mind that I've done that. He is semi-retired from private practice, so we're grateful he makes time to do other worthwhile things like today's program and two others that he did. As some of you know, Dr. Ray presented a most interesting talk on pronouns and gender last February, and in November he covered how social media is profoundly influencing America. We're going to have another conversation today, and I'll get to ask questions, and then you'll have an opportunity to ask your questions. But I'll start by just saying, Dr. Ray, some of us have tried to understand marriage after 40 or 50 years, and now we're giving you less than an hour. So what do you have to say about that? And you can unmute yourself. And
I think I'm unmuted. You can hear me okay?
You are unmuted, sir. Go ahead, please.
As always, it's a pleasure to be here, and I consider this a opportunity to explore ideas. And I got to tell you that Ron's an active participant in this, helping me all through the process in terms of trying to organize this in a reasonable and logical manner so that we can get our ideas across. And then we kind of pick interesting subjects that we think people might be interested in. And so, Ron and I were talking about this landscape of marriage and what's going on in marriage and how we all view it. And I can't see the audience, but I assume that, most of us are older. Most of us were married sometime between, I assume, 60s, 70s, and maybe 80s. And so we've been in this game a long time of love and marriage. And how long we've been in it kind of shapes how we feel about it and what our expectations is. And we call it the changing landscape because it's something like a landscape. And if you were looking at a landscape, you might see mountains, you might see valleys, you might see different seasons, you might see sheep on the meadow, you might see flowers. And so I hope that our view today would be of the whole landscape, a changing landscape, but we do have to sometimes go in and look at a particular area within that landscape to try to clarify it. But I don't want anybody to get confused or overwhelmed by numbers or data, because the guide here is look at the trends. Think about the trends in our own lives. Think about the trends that we're going to see in some of the databases. And just to kind of give you an overview of my perspective is that whether you look at 60 years of marriage or whether you look at 100 years of marriage, you're looking at a long time of an institution which is changing and evolving. And when people say, well, why should we do this? Why should we look at this? Why can't it just be like it always was? Well, because how it always was depends on where you started. And if we were going to start at one of our beginning recorded times and we were talking about, well, we all have monogamous marriages, people wouldn't understand what we were talking about. And by that, I mean, look at the Bible, look at Abraham and Jacob and Moses and David and Solomon and Gideon. What is a monogamous marriage to them? They had no idea of it. Marriages was multiple wives, having children, producing progeny, becoming like the stars in the sky and moving on forever and ever. The idea of a single couple coming together, for a period of time really emerges about 2,000, 2,500 years ago with the evolving of Judeo-Christian ethics and of the Bible saying that men and women should be together. And that evolution of monogamy came about really fairly recently. And even if you look at that recent history, if we look back to our parents' marriages or our grandparents' marriages, they were very different entities than certainly what we're looking at when we see our children and grandchildren being married. And so this is today the idea of looking at how marriage as we might have known it in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, which was predominantly male dominated, moved forward by finances, moved with a direction of trying to protect the woman, but also to define her role clearly in the family, we'll get an overview of what we have. So I see Ron has put up kind of a exploring changes in the areas. So, Ron, you want to look at that with us
Yeah.
together?
When we got together and talked about this, I figured out between what you thought was important that we'd cover four areas. What are adult kids and grandkids, how they're looking at it. And since we're a senior group, that's a little bit different group, certainly than us. And then seniors, folks in our age group, how do we look at marriage? And then, this different views on having kids. You felt that was important. We should talk about it. And if time allows, we can get into intermarriage, the concept of what's happening with religion and how it affects it. And obviously, same sex is a topical issue. With that, I know that you thought this screen was interesting. Tell us about this.
Yeah, I think this is a screen about altering or shifting expectations about marriage. And it's a little complicated, and I wouldn't have anybody worry about the details too much. I just want to kind of look at it from the perspective of when I got married in 1971 versus somebody getting married in 2024. And these are data that's accumulated in different kinds of ways. That's why this is a psychiatric discussion. It's a sociology discussion. It's a psychocultural discussion. It's data gathered by various kinds of surveys and by databases from various agencies, like the government has agencies looking at surveying. Often I'll be showing you stuff that comes from Pew surveys, which are pretty effective surveys looking at certain populations. So this is a survey of younger people. And what does it say about their expectations about marriage? And this could be shocking to some of us, but it is that about 40% say that marriage as an institution is outdated. 73% say that it's just too expensive to get married. I don't want to get married. It's just too expensive. 85% say that really marriage is not essential for a full, complete, and satisfactory life. 72% say, I'm just not currently at age 25 or 30 interested in getting married. But as hope goes on eternally, when you look at one of the final data, that one in the lower box, it says that 83% are still hoping to get married someday. So we have a young cohort of people who are skeptical about marriage, but who hold on to the idea that it offers something important and relevant in our lives, and that it's an ideal to strive for. But in reality, we'll see in other data that marriage has changed a lot. So here's a graph that shows 144 years of looking at marriage, starting from now 1860 going to 210. The top line, the blue one, is the issue of how many people are actually married, and the bottom one is how many get divorced. And this one's interesting because it shows per 1,000 people. And please don't get caught up. These graphs are going to show different data. So don't ask me why is one a certain number and why it's not. Look at the trend. This is the landscape. It's springtime or it's fall, and most of the leaves are green. You're going to show me, most of the leaves are colored yellow, but you're going to show me some that are green. So don't get too caught up in the data. But look at the trends. Can you go back to that last one, Ron, for a second, though? And here, I think the interesting part of this, two things to take away from this chart. One is that economic and social forces play a role. So if you look at the rate of marriage from 1860 to World War I ending, it's pretty stable. Then there's a spike in marriages. And then after about 1930, the Great Depression comes and more people are getting divorced. That suggests that there's some economic pressures playing a role in the divorces. Then it stabilizes with some peaks. But if you notice during World War II, there's an increase in marriage. Some of that's to protect men. Some of that's to have children to avoid services. Some of that is to provide stability for the women while the men are away. And it goes quite high, up to 15 per 100,000. But as soon as World War II ends, the rate of marriage goes down and down and down until about 1960, and then it starts to merge up again. So that's the marriage rate affected by economic and social factors in society. Look at the peaks on the divorce. The divorce peaks occurred in the mid-1940s. Sociologists explain that by saying, look, these men came home, they'd gotten married rather quickly, and they didn't want to stay married. So all of a sudden you get a peak in divorces following World War II. Then it stabilizes with very less marriage, less divorces in the 60s. But then in 1970, something important happened. It was called no-fault divorce. It was now that you did not have to claim any kind of abuse or bad behavior on the part of the spouse. It freed up people to say, I'm just not comfortable in this marriage, in this relationship, and I want to move forward. And that's why from 70 to up to about 1980, 85, you saw a great rise in divorce. And now we have a lowering down. So that divorce at this point in 220, that ends at 210, but in 220 is determined to be the lowest it's ever been in American history. So that's an interesting phenomenon about length of marriage and frequency of divorce. So you can go on to the next one, Ron. And that gets into what's happening with our children and grandchildren. Why are we who got married, some of you who might have gotten married in the 1950s or 60s, were married at 18, 19, and 20. That's a rare occurrence today. And now it's kind of, why are these kids waiting so long? And you see the data. By 1960, the average age for a male was about 23, for a woman about 21. It's gone up from 23 to 30.2 in 2023 and 28.4 age for women. So there's just a substantial increase in time or age of first marriage, which is important for everybody to consider. So when our grandchildren are not getting married, we shouldn't be worried like I was married at 23 or 24. Why aren't these kids getting married? What's happening to the world? There is a delay.
Ray, we understand that our slides are coming through clear on Zoom, but they're a little bit fuzzy in the auditorium.
Okay.
We don't see that, you and I. So we may need to better, you may need to better explain the numbers that we get on charts.
Happy to do that.
Having said that, this is more of a
Okay,
question.
they need to be smaller so we can see the whole slide.
I'm sorry, you're muffled. Can you repeat that? Hold the microphone a little bit further from your mouth, Arnie.
The slide is too enlarged. They need to be smaller so that we can see the whole slide.
Okay, we're having a problem. I'm running this from my computer and I can't make that smaller, but I think we can get around that. For example, it's not important what I'm going to show on this screen here, because I'm asking Dr. Ray, how do you see changing gender roles affecting the marriage landscape? You know, I mean, I'm asking this question because in my view, in my opinion, I don't think we're that many decades away from seeing wives as property. And I know more progress is needed. And I certainly know that, you know, the women's issues is an important one. Without getting into the politics, how are we seeing the changing gender roles? And I'm going to stop the share and come back on when we have another question. Go ahead, Dr. Ray.
Okay, yeah, in terms of gender role, clearly the most pervasive thinking is that it's changing in the roles of women that have altered the landscape of marriage significantly. And in terms of gender role, we have, okay, what's happened with women and their lives in America that's changed substantially how marriage is looked at? And I'd raise a few issues for the group to consider. Number one is that the Equal Rights Amendment, we know, never got passed. But even though it never got passed, some of the issues involved in the Equal Rights Amendment have taken the either established cultural view or established legal views. And that means that there's more opportunities for women to do other things than get married at age 22 and raise children and go on and do the normative things that we saw many of our parents do in the 50s and 60s. The next thing was, I mentioned no-fault divorce, which occurred in the 1970s or so. And that gave women the right to leave a marriage, because prior to that, there had to be proof that the husband had done something awful in terms of abuse or injustices to get out of the marriage. So that allowed women that opportunity. Next, we have contraception, which occurred in 1972, when the Supreme Court said that unmarried couples had the right to contraception, and so did married couples. And that gave women more control over the timing of their children. And then lastly, we have in 2015, same-sex marriages, which did alter the role of relationships between men and women and women. So we have a number of issues that are cultural involving the role of women in our lives. I'd remind you to think about the concept of a dowry. A dowry was a concept from the old country, goes back thousands of years actually, in which a amount of money was presented along with the marriage, and that was by history given to ensure that the woman had some financial stability because she was considered property. And you could say, well, women were not considered property in the 1950s by any means, but the role definition of a woman in the 1950s, other than Rosie Riveter, who had gone off to war, but then she returned home to take care of the children, to run the house, and to make the guys working at the advertising agencies and Mad Men have an easier life so that they could go to their martini lunches. They didn't come home and change diapers. They had a well-defined, gender-defined life, but so did the woman. And the changes that have taken place in the last 50, 60 years are reflection of those
Am I right? Am I right in thinking that this is a relatively new, I mean, when we look at societal changes, isn't this relatively new? I mean, we think of it as happening within the lifetime of our grandparents for sure. I know when my mother was born, women couldn't vote until the 20s. So, I mean, we're talking about just about 100 years. That is a major change when we look at the world of centuries and eons from before. I'm stumbling here, but I guess that has to be one of the most important changes that have occurred in our lifetime is the changing role of women, with more to go, more to come.
Yeah, I think at our age, you're absolutely right. That when we look back at the relationships we had early in life, I mean, my wife needed my permission in 1971 to get a credit card. I had to vouch for her having a credit card because, you know, at that point, women were not allowed their own credit cards. And in my mother's life, although she worked a little bit, it was very uncommon for women to work. At that time in 1950, maybe 20% of women were working at all. And today it's up to 60% of women working outside the house. So it changes, the women issues have changed the dynamics of marriage in major ways, much more than anything happening with men, other than men becoming more attuned to what the cultural issues are in the society that they're living in.
Right. Dr. Ray, I'm going to try to see if the next slide is something that our group is able to see.
That we saw that one.
Let me go back. I'm stopping this one. I've got to the, bear with me, screen share. This screen.
Yeah.
In the auditorium, can you see that blue line?
Yeah, but and don't worry about the numbers. Don't worry that you can't read the number.
Yeah, I'm going to stop the screen share after you have a chance to explain what this screen shows us.
Okay, again, don't worry about the numbers. Look at the landscape. Look at that trend. Now, this is the issue of cohabitation. So I don't know how many of this audience ever lived with anybody without getting married or before married. Can't tell that. But I suspect that if we look back at 1960 and you look at that number, which is about 300,000 people living together in America. Most of us did not have that opportunity, and those of us who might have tried were turned down. I, for one, was turned down when I offered 1971 to live together with my wife, but she said she would certainly get married. That was the established time in 1971. If you look at the trend, though, look at the trend from 1970 to 2008, went up to 6.79 million people cohabitating. Now, by cohabitating, I mean living together for some period of time without being legally sanctioned or religiously sanctioned. Now, today, that number is, I want to get the right number, about 22 million. So it's gone up 3 times, since the end of that graph. So 20 million cohabitating. Just to give you an idea, 131 million over the age of 15 years old are married, and 116 million are single. But so this says that there seems to be in this culture an acceptance of cohabitation. So that's why parents are not outraged when they're 20-year-olds or 22-year-olds saying, well, I'm going to live with this girl for a little while. I'm going to live with this guy. We're going to try it out, see how it goes. Or sometimes there's cohabitation for 15 or 20 or 30 years in lieu of marriage. So when you see the marriage rate dropping, we can't always determine, well, what does that really mean? Does that mean that people are living alone? Or does it mean that they're just living together with other means other than the, quote, sanctity of marriage?
You had mentioned the no-fault divorce and the woman's role. Maybe we should move on to the technology and communication part, because I had this question, will our grandkids be looking at ChatGPT as looking for the perfect mate? And I know you had a chance to look at this. What are your thoughts about how technology and communication is changing things?
Okay, well, let's go back. I don't know. I can't see the audience, but let's go back to looking at our own lives. How did we meet the people who we wound up spending the next 20, 30, 40, or 50 years with? In 1920, the study showed that the average couple met within their neighborhood. They lived within 6 or 8 blocks. They had gone to school together, high school or college. They had lived in the same neighborhood. They had belonged to some of the same organizations, religious and otherwise, and that's how it came about. Today, the technology is very different, and I don't have the data in front of me, but it's about 40% of people state that they meet people through internet. Now, what do I mean through the internet? I don't mean a Zoom call. I mean the areas like what's called Tinder, Match.com, Harmony. For some of us, it's JDate. There are older ones too. This gives you an increasingly broad opportunity through technology of meeting people outside the shtetl or the neighborhood that we had grown up in. And so that's a crazily different dynamic, than it was during my dating life or during my parents' dating life, because we did not have those techniques available. When you look at how people meet today, 40% meet online, 27% meet at a bar, 20% meet through friends, 11% through work, and 9% through school. So that's a shifting dynamic with technology. It just says the way we're meeting, introducing, dating, and evaluating people is much different than it had ever been in the history of marriage. Now, Ron, you also said, well, could ChatGPT help you decide, kind of who's going to be your perfect spouse? So, this morning, I just entered this question to ChatGPT just to give, I'll summarize it. I said, I'm currently 26 years old because there was a time when I was, and single. I'm looking for a good long-term relationship. I'm a physician, a psychiatrist. I like reading. I'm not that interested in sports, but I do like theater. I'm a bit shy, and I'm on the short side. I'm Jewish, and I would love to meet the optimal person for me. Okay? So, what did ChatGPT tell me? Now, none of this is going to be revolutionary, but in about 30 seconds, it said, 1, explore shared interests. Find somebody who enjoys reading and theater. Join a book club. Go to literary events. Engage yourself in local theater productions. Engage in intellectual conversations. Try to look for social gatherings and discussions where you can engage in stimulating conversations. And then number 3, it said, try online dating. Online dating platforms allow you to specify your preferences and get specific individuals and be honest and upfront about your personality's interests. What they're saying is don't lie on your online dating. And then it said attend Jewish events. This goes back to the neighborhood. I want to belong to B'nai B'rith or something else to meet other people. Embrace your shyness. Well, that's a good psychological strategy. While being shy can be challenging, go to smaller events and engage in one-to-one conversations. Then focus on compatibility, which is a good advice. And I like this one. It said, consider height preferences, but don't worry about it too much because different physical traits can still lead to meaningful communication. Take your time and be patient. Now, I did not. My life story is a little different. I didn't take my time. Be proactive, meaning that you have to go out and seek those special interests. And lastly, stay true to yourself. So there's nothing revolutionary in that, but it's interesting that a kid at age 26 could go on and try to find some advice from our AI friends about, kind of what's the optimal way to engage in dating.
This may be a little off topic, but I think it'd be interesting to get your views. How do you use ChatGPT knowing that you sometimes might get bullshit out of it?
Well, number one, you have to use it using critical analysis. Okay. I could use my own judgment at saying that this wasn't telling me that I should contact Taylor Swift and make efforts at trying to get her, as a prospective, dating person. So you got to use your own judgment. Secondly, when you get to factual issues, you've got to go back to other sources like Google or other references or even clinical articles if you're doing things scientifically, and you have to recheck. And thirdly, you also can go to different AI platforms to be able to get information. So check, double check, and recheck.
Okay. I'm getting advice from Jill that says I should turn it over to her on the screen share. So I'm happy to do that. We don't need it for the time being, so I'm just going to go on, and while she does that,
Okay.
My question to you that we organized before was let's get into this issue of how education and career priorities have changed. And what my question was, you've got people that I've run into that say, hey, I love women, especially. I love my job. I'm up for a big promotion. And now he tells me he can't live without me. So how does the concept of marriage to the young people, how is it how does education and career priorities affect them?
Okay, now, again, we're talking about different social economic groups, but I think in the one we're most involved in, which is our children and grandchildren, the desire to achieve, especially on the part of the woman, has escalated dramatically over the past 30, 40 years. The number of women in college exceeds men. The number of women in graduate school exceeds men. Their successful completion is higher than men. So that we have a cohort of women who are upwardly mobile, highly educated, and imagine that, at age 21 or 22, somebody's proposing marriage to these women. Well, they're not in their junior year of college going to want to give up all aspirations to get married and raise children. So the idea is that clearly the aspiration to be educated, to be independent, to be able to have a successful career, to be, stimulated and engaged in activities other than child rearing and taking care of a home are driving some of this issue. So when you look at that age of woman increasing over time, much of that's related to higher college and educational and work achievements. Now, in lower socioeconomic groups, actually, the age of marriage is lower because they are not with the same, quote, pressures or expectations. But in the age groups we're talking about, if my grandchild, who is now, my oldest is 16, I would be very surprised if she's not going to graduate school, because she has the ability to do it. That's going to delay making the decision about marriage, until age 26, 27, or 28. And then, like your statement it is, and then she's going to want to say, well, why can't I start my career? Well, now you start your career and you have your career for 4 or 5 years. Well, that brings you into the 30s. And so later marriages, to get a sense of personal fulfillment is very important. I don't want to do too much technical words, but I want the group to think about two words now in terms of relationships. You and I, Ron, I think viewed marriage, and I'm making an assumption, I know I did, as a cornerstone. We got married as a cornerstone of our adulthood. It was saying to society, I'm established, I'm married, I'm going to have children, I fit in, and I build from there. Today's youth and younger people see marriage as a capstone. The capstone is the thing you put on top. Therefore, I'm not getting married to have a cornerstone. I'm building my self-esteem. I'm building my professional identity. I'm building my income. I'm building my life experiences. And marriage is a capstone phenomenon to that. And that's why it's later. And that's why in many senses, it could also be better, healthier, and more long-lasting than it was for many of our generation.
Ray, I want to move on to the slide 13. I'm asking Jill to put that one on. Determinants of length of marriage. I know that there's a lot on that slide. She's going to flip to that one. 13, back up. That's a little bit too far. Prior one, next one, next one, next one. Oh, no, you're going backwards.
Farther around.
Well, the determinants on length of marriage, slide 13, had these points: increasing age of first marriage,
right,
decline in marriage rates, divorce rates, changing social attitudes, economic issues, education and gender equality, and cohabitation. You basically talked about that, but what's the big picture on that?
Well, the big picture is, look, many people are worried about the status of marriage. Marriages have always been, for the majority of people, short-lived with lots of divorces. Average age of somebody, the average length of marriage if somebody gets divorced is about 9 years. 50% or so of marriages end in divorce, okay? But longer marriages that persist seem to have certain qualities, okay? Obviously, there's the personality of the two people who get married. That's the consider one. But if you're older at the time of your first age of marriage, you have a better chance of success. You're not 22 or 23 wondering at age 40, well, what didn't I experience? You had experiences, you had opportunities to do things, and you create your life together. The decline in marriage rates, okay, is also indicating or suggestive of a length of marriage, because if there's fewer marriages in terms of the number of marriages per year, statistically, the number who stay married is greater. The same with divorce rates. The divorce rates happen fairly early in marriages. So once you get to year 20, 25, 30, the actual incidence of divorce is less than 0.5% per year. So longer lasting marriages stay married. Changing social attitudes do determine the length of marriage in the sense that older, wiser, smarter decisions, not feeling, for example, there's arguments about shotgun weddings. I've heard conversations where people say, look, most important thing is having a father in the house, therefore you should have shotgun weddings. Those kinds of weddings don't persist. Right. Economic issues play a role because people want stability in their marriages, and the couples that achieve it do have stability. Education and gender equality create longer marriages because people are more, I should say, wiser and thoughtful and contemplative about what they're doing. And lastly, the cohabitation is a confusing issue because while it's very increasing in volume, it complicates how long people are actually married, because we know people who can cohabitate for long periods of time. Now, the data says that cohabitation is not as stable as marriage, especially if people are living together before a commitment to marriage. If you make a commitment to get married and then say, okay, we want to live together for a year, but we're intending to get married, your divorce rate is about 23%. If you say, we want to live together, but we're not sure we want to get married, we're not making a commitment, it's kind of a trial, and then you get married, your divorce rate's about 10%, 15% more than that, about 35, 40%.
Ray, I want to get into a lightning round. I want Jill to put on a screen and just make a quick comment on some slides. Okay. Jill, put on the next slide. What's your big picture? What was this telling us?
This says that younger people on the whole are not getting married. They're not getting married for a couple of reasons. Number one, more are cohabitating. Number two is there are more single people in the world, right? And number three is, given that women have alternatives, they do not feel the pressure to get married to feel a fulfilling life, that they can have fulfillment in other ways, including longstanding non-marriage relationships, including having children on their own, including having same-sex marriages, et cetera, same-sex relationships, et cetera, et cetera. So fulfillment is not with the traditional mode of, you know, I go to high school, I go to college, I get married, I have a family, and I raise it. So that's why younger people are not getting married at the same rate as it was in 1970. When you looked at the data, 70% of all people between the ages of like 22 and 60 were married. Today, it's 50.
Right, Jill, put on the next slide, please.
And marriage rates are indeed overall looking at being at all-time lows. Now, this is marriage. It's the definition of, I went to the courthouse, I got my certificate. It doesn't mean I necessarily saw the rabbi, minister, or priest, but I have a legally sanctioned marriage. It went from a high in 1970 on this chart of 86% down to 33%. So something's happening fundamentally in the landscape of marriage and relationships that is altered from the time that I was married.
And
Now,
then,
whether it's good or
Jill,
bad is another story, you know, that we have to talk about in kind of the complexity of this landscape, because again, we're looking at the broad picture.
okay, Jill, put the next one on, because I guess younger people, women have a different feeling than men on this.
Correct. Okay. Now, when we looked at the first slide that talked about changing expectations, this is elaborating on that. When you look at millennial and Gen Z populations, and let me just define that for you. I think, Ron, you and I, well, probably you're a little older than I am, so you're probably in the silent generation. That's raised from 79 to 96. That's silent. That's the Eisenhower generation. Then we have the boomers, who are about up to 78, from about 60 to 78. Then Generation X, which is ages 44 to 59. Then millenniums, and this is who we're talking about, 28 to 43, that's millennial. And Generation Z is 12 to 27. So Generation Z is just in that age group now where more and more are contemplating marriage. But when you ask them about marriage as a tradition, women will say, 50% of them will say, it's an outdated tradition. I don't need that. And men are a little bit actually more traditional, with only 40% saying that they don't need it. But still, this is not the data you would have gotten from talking to you, I, or you and me or my friends in the 1960s and 70s.
Right. Jill, would you put on skip slide, go to 17 and skip it and go to slide 18? I think we should get into divorce and question in that one. I have a question after you take a look at this. Tell us what you get out of this slide.
This is confirming what we talked about. When we talk about rates per 1,000, that's rates per 1,000 marriages in the United States from the year in 21 years, from 2000 to 21. And what it's basically showing is that there has been a slow but steady decline in the divorce rate, which is the bottom line. You see it going from 4 per 1,000 in 2020 to about 2.5 in 2021. Marriage rates are also declining. We saw that in another chart, with a bit of an upsurge in the last year. But that blip has to be seen over time. But bottom line, when you look at the data for 2022 and 23, divorce rates are at their lowest rate they've ever been, and marriage rates are at their lowest rate they've ever been.
The question that I have is, if we're getting married when we're a little bit older and maybe wiser, how might that affect the issue of staying together? Do you think this helps?
I think personally, I think it does. It gives, as I said, more stability and knowing people better, a longer opportunity to be together. Cohabitation of people who are committed to getting married seems to work out. Today, over 70% of people who get married have lived together. That's a dramatic shift from 1970. Okay. And if you get
Jill,
to know
could you put
people well.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead. I was going to put another slide up, but finish your
If you get to
statement,
know your
please.
partner well, if you get to learn to be accepting and kind and understanding about the nature of the relationship, you increase your ability to stay married. But obviously, staying married is a very important psychological issue to discuss. And why people stay married is an incredibly complicated thing, just as why they get divorced. But maturity, age, wisdom, the idea of being compassionate and concerned about other people's attitudes are important. But Ron, we also have to raise one other issue, and I want to use the term here. There's a difference in how people are viewing relationships. You and I got married, quote, till death do us part. That is a romantic view of marriage. Find this person, it's my soulmate, and we stay together through hell or high water, and we make it work. That's romantic. But there's another view of relationships in which it's called confluent love. And by confluent, I mean it flows. And it flows, I'm in love with this person as long as this is a satisfying relationship. And if this is no longer a satisfying relationship, I owe it to myself and the other person to move on and find another satisfying relationship. And that's why divorce occurs, infidelity, betrayal, a sense of loneliness in relationships, or a sense of hurt. So romantic ideals have always been the historic of marriage, but it's always been kind of a fantasy. Confluent love says, I'm married because I'm getting satisfaction and I'm continuing to get satisfaction out of the relationship. And if I'm not getting that satisfaction, then I need to move on. I owe it to myself and my partner to move on. And that's why many divorces are now much more amicable as these confluent relationships, both the men and the women, move on. Doesn't mean there's not a lot of hard feelings or tension, but there's more moving on.
Jill, could you move to the next slide, please? Ray, in the interest of time, I know you and I both felt we had more content. You had more content that you'd like to cover than we'd have in an hour. So I'm cutting this down.
Sure.
I think we're going to need to skip over intermarriage, but
Right.
maybe get into this slide and tell us the gist of it.
Okay,
I'm not sure this is the best one, but if we wanted to wind up on divorce, this tells the number of divorcing per thousand married persons.
And I think we were talking about senior divorces. We were
Yes.
talking about divorce in senior in the world of
Go to
seniors.
the next slide, 21.
And that's
Jill.
that's the idea of gray divorce. And this gets into something that was unheard of and almost very rare in our day, which was older people getting divorced. I can't see that slide. Let me pull it up on me on my thing here.
Now, Jill is trying to lower to decrease the size of it, but I think what we're showing is between 1970 and 2019, how there seemed to have been an increase each decade.
Correct. And if you look at that top box, which is the lightest box, it shows in 1970, 13% of people over the age, I think, of 65. Yeah, over the age of 65 got divorced, 13%. That moved up progressively into 1990, where it was 15%. And now in 2019, the data shows that up to 25% of older people have gotten divorced. This is a shift in attitude. Now, remember, it doesn't reflect the data. It doesn't change the data that divorce is still at a all-time low. But when you're looking at couples who've been married a while and the individuals are over 65 years old, there definitely is a shift to people saying, I don't want to remain in this marriage, even I've been married 25 or 30 years. And I was actually looking up, I don't know if I have it here, we're all hearing about famous marriages that are getting divorced after many years. Maria Shriver, Susan Sarandon, Dan Aykroyd, Bill Ray Cyrus, Kris Jenner, all married 20, 30 years, getting divorced. Now, it's still a very small percentage, but it's an increasing number.
Right. I think, Jill, if you could slip to go to 2 slides forward where it says percentage of persons, that one.
Okay.
Tell us this one I thought was important, Ray, about the previously married who remarry.
Right. It shows that there is a tendency, to want to be remarried. but that tendency gets greater the older we get. It's at age 55, you see, to 64, 67% of people who are married, okay, will remarry again. Even at 65, 50% will remarry again. Versus the younger population, 35 to 44, 25 to 34, where they tend to stay single. Now, why is that? Number one, because single is a more acceptable social status for younger people. They have a group of people who are also single. In the older group, being single is not as socially easy. It's harder to make new friends, and you look to couple up again. So older people are now remarrying with greater frequency. There's another slide that says that men tend to remarry more often than women. And that's an interesting psychological phenomenon because, Ron, you and I may like to be taken care of. We may feel more dependent. And the women who we would like to take care of us are no longer interested in that. They're happy remaining single. They're happy taking care of themselves, being with their grandchildren and doing other things and just having companionship. So everybody wants companionship. Men tend to feel more secure getting married again.
You mentioned the word grandchildren. I think we should get into that topic. And Jill, if you would move forward to slide 26, it says, is married with kids no longer the gold standard? One more slide forward.
Yeah, here we go.
There
Okay.
we go.
So now on the bottom of this chart, and I can't see the dates, I think it's 1970 moving to 2021. The top is our traditional married with kids. Ron, she moved it down one. Can we go back? Okay. The top is our traditional married with kids. It shows that in 1970, that was the status of about 67 to 70% of families. Okay. And look at cohabitating with kids was 0. Unpartnered with kids was 4%. Married and no kids was 18%. Now, if you move from over towards the right, I think it is.
The
Or shrink the
cohabiting.
chart down again. Can you shrink it down a little bit? There we go. So on the bottom line, you have 2020 or so. You move from 67% in 1970 to now 37% of the families are married and children. 21 are married and no children. And then cohabitating and no kids, 7, and unpartnered, 6, and cohabitating with no kids, 5. So those are increasing. But we do know that in our society, that especially in the higher socioeconomic classes, the number of children per family has definitely gone down. In 1960, the number of children on average was 2.33. Now, I'm not sure where that 0.33 child came from, but that's the average. That's 1960. 1970, it's 2.28. It's dropped down by a 1/10. And in 2021, it's 1.82. Now, interestingly, though, there are charts that show that this is for higher socioeconomic classes, and that the lower socioeconomic classes, the people with less money, are actually having more children. And I don't have that data readily available, but it's interesting that when you break it down, oh, here it is. In less than $10,000 per income, there will be 63 children per 1,000. After 200,000 income, it's down to 45 per 1,000. So that the socioeconomic class affects how many children, and it's an inverse ratio. People who have aspirations for their children in terms of education, college, and the quality of their lives are having fewer children, while those in lower socioeconomic classes tend to want to have and are having large families. Why that is unclear. Is it lack of access to the ability to control the number of children, or is it some other forces that are playing a role? I just don't know. Nobody knows at this point.
Jill, put the next slide up just to quickly to just dramatize the point about married couples having fewer children. And that just clearly just pull up a little bit because you can see that charts there on the bottom.
Yeah, once again,
Married with kids.
married with
That's
kids
a repeat.
from the time we were married in the 70s, 67 to 70%, now down to 37%.
Right.
So many of our children are not going to have children, and that's going to be disheartening. I see many patients who can't quite understand why they don't have grandchildren. They don't have grandchildren because of the reflection of this chart that their children chose voluntarily not to bring children. Now, why is that? Psychologically, there may be people who just don't want to have children, but if you think about the millennials and the Gen Zs, they are much more concerned about economic uncertainties in the world. They're concerned about climate change and the environment. I think you're having a talk about the environment in a couple of weeks. There's women alternative paths to fulfillment. I can get fulfillment by becoming a well-respected member of a corporation or a profession, and the social acceptability. You know, while grandparents are devastated sometimes by not having children, when you talk to your children's children, your children's peers, they say that's a personal choice, doesn't really matter. And they respect it.
Right here is the challenge. We've got 3 quick topics, 3 more slides, and then we can turn it over to the Q&A. But
Yeah.
this would probably require less than a minute for each one. Jill,
Okay.
could you go to the next slide? We want to talk about intermarriage, same-sex couples, and religion.
Real quickly, intermarriage is the loving case. Look at the chart. Down in 1970, there were none because it was illegal. Before 1972, it was illegal for an interracial couple to get married. And then it moved from 4% up to, and I can't see the number, but it's something like 16%. Yeah, up to 16%. So look, it's a significant move in terms of intermarried couples. We also know that there's more marriages of people with different ethnicities, and it's becoming part of our multicultural phenomenon. And some people actually think it's a good thing. Get multiracial couples to marry, you'll have multiracial children, and you will ultimately over time lessen some of the societal tensions over race and ethnicity.
Next slide, Jill, on
Yeah.
same-sex marriage. That's even dramatically less.
Right now, we've stayed out of the political realm. But the fascinating part about this is, if you look in 1970, in 2015, there was 0.7% of marriages were same sex. It's gone up to 1.1 in 2021. And yet, if you think about all of the cultural issues and cultural battles over these issues, it's relating to 1.1% of the married population. So we have to ask ourselves, why is this such an issue? What's made it that way? And that ultimately might get to moral or religious values. And I think that maybe the last chart that you want to take a look at is, what are the roles of religion in terms of the changing attitudes towards
the next slide.
and dating? So this is an interesting chart because if you look at the top, it shows religious people. It shows people who were defined as Christians. And if you look at the data from 1972, you had 90% of people identifying in some form of Christianity. I don't have the charts for Judaism, but this is Christianity. Now you bring it today to 2020, and you're down to 63%. Look at the people who say that they are religiously unaffiliated. That means I can feel Jewish, but I'm not belonging to a temple. That means if I'm not belonging to a temple or synagogue, the rabbi's views of my life have less merit or less importance. That went from almost none, 0.5. I don't know if any of you remembered Madeline Murray, but she was an early atheist, and she was just this outrageous character. Who could possibly believe that? To now up to 30% of people saying I'm religiously unaffiliated. And that means that there's a change in the sacrament of marriage. So people aren't getting married to be part of the church. They're not getting married for God's permission. They're getting married because they care about each other and they feel that it's an appropriate adult thing to do. Okay.
Jill, you can stop the screen share. And we can see Dr. Ray. I think we're at a point, Doctor, where we can get to Q&A. But first, is there any last minute comments you'd like to make?
Yeah, I just want to summarize this, okay? And I kind of pulled this out of some material I've been reading, but I just want to summarize it this way. Marriage has changed because America has changed. We cannot return to the model of the mid-20th century, because we no longer live in the culture or the economy that created that model. And while some would argue we wouldn't want to return to that model, even if we could, both men and women have greater choices than 50 years ago, not only in regards to who they marry, but also if they do want to marry and what kind of family they want to build. And if experts agree on one thing, it is that these choices are some of the most important we make for our overall happiness. So this landscape of marriage could be scary or frightening if we look at it from the perspective of all those leaves are turning yellow and falling off the trees. Or they can look positive in terms of, look, this is a changing landscape. It's changed from biblical times to the 1950s. It's changed from the 1950s to the 2000s. And we have to kind of embrace change because there's nothing that's permanent. And the nature of marriage is not permanent.
Dr. Ray, I personally thank you for helping us understand a pretty complex topic. It still remains one, but helping us understand it in less than an hour. We started a little bit late. We could extend this a little longer by getting Q&A. I know there's a friend trying to reach us on chat, but let's first start with the auditorium. If there are questions from the auditorium, I'm turning it over to Arnie to get those for us. Go ahead, Arnie.
Okay, thank you. You may have said this, I couldn't hear everything you said, but the younger people not marrying, I mean, like I know a girl who is 30-ish, went with a man for a few years. They're living together, no talk of marriage, and they know they don't want children. Why? Why? I mean, I understand all these choices, but why don't they want to have a family?
Well, it gets to for you and I, that's a hard question because we've defined ourselves around our children and then around our grandchildren. It's kind of the way we have our psychological definition. I'm telling you that this millennial and Gen Z, a number of them are defining themselves around something else. It's defining themselves around the satisfaction of the relationship I can have with one person at a certain time in my life. It's defining myself around the successes I can have in business. It's defining myself around the world, the trips I can take, the experiences I can have, and it's defining myself around the friendships that I can create with other couples who likely will have no children either. And so I cannot give you a specific answer for this couple, but this is kind of the answer that we're going to hear more and more of. I just don't want to do this because it doesn't fit in with my need for a compassionate, important relationship in my life. And what if I want to leave this woman? Or what if I want to leave this man? I don't want to leave these children impacted by divorce. I don't want to leave these children in a world where the climate gets warmer and there are floods in California, so that I had to cancel my trip to California because of the floods and climate control. But those are political issues and I'll stay out of them. But it's just the nature of these younger generations.
In my day and age, the saying was, why buy the cow when you can get the milk for free?
Can you have the microphone hold it further from your mouth because we couldn't hear the question?
In my day and age, why buy the cow when you can get the milk for free?
It wasn't a question, but that's okay.
It actually has to do with why my wife wouldn't want to live with me, but I'll leave that to another story.
It's less.
And we've been married 52 years, so it kind of worked out.
Oh, if there's less marriages, will that sociologically change like everything else because there'll be less kids and there'll be less employment? And if people are getting older, in the people who are in their 40s and 50s, will they start looking toward marriage and get more marriages then?
Well, there's two parts to that question. Number one is clearly the decline in the birth rate and fewer children impacts on any society in which that's happening. I believe it's happening in China now, and clearly it's happening in the United States. I don't want to get political, but that also raises the issue of immigration. For most of American history, from kind of the 1820s to 1920, we depended on immigration for labor. And that's what built America. And now we may have to start looking at how much that's a factor. But in your second part of the question kind of had to do with the issue of personal satisfaction. And I think that's, yes, older people are going to be affected if there's less of a labor market to put money into plans like Social Security and Medicare. And that's why Congress has got to start looking at certain questions like ages of claiming, and what do we do in terms of having these funds available for the aging population. But if you look at our demographics, America is an aging country, and something has to be positively and productively done about it. And I don't want to be biased about it. And it can't be returning to the 1950s or 60s ideal society. That won't work.
Right, Dr. Ray, I just have to ask you in the auditorium also. Wait, one moment, please. Arnie, hold, please. Dr. Ray, are you okay continuing with questions? I want to be sensitive to your time. And then I know we started late, but anyone that needs to leave from Zoom, we understand you won't be rude if you need to leave, and in the auditorium as well. But we're happy to stay.
Yeah, Ron, I'm disappointed I can't be there with you. I would be happy to stay for as long as necessary. I'd like to talk with people individually. So whatever the group wants, I'm happy to do.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Arnie.
My question is that if couples are start living together. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Well, it's financial. You live together, but you're not married, and one person has a lot of investments, or he owns the house, or she owns the house. What happens with the money, and how does it get, when you're married, usually it's together. But if you're not married and somebody is making more and the other person is not making enough, how does that work out?
Well, it's very individual. First of all, if you're not married and living together, most people are going to have their own bank accounts, their own possessions. Somebody's going to have title to the car. Somebody's going to have title to the house. You know, I mean, it's going to be an individual thing. So if that doesn't last, the separation is very easy. You take what's yours and you leave, you know, from your video or record collection, you know, to the automobile that's yours. It's in the issue of marriage that it gets much more complicated, because then there's community property. No community property in cohabitation, unless there's preset agreements. And that would be the other thing. In cohabitation, you can have legally preset agreements, and there are lawyers who are happy to set that up. I'm not sure if that answered the question, because I didn't hear it all, Ron.
That sounded like the question was what differences when partners have differences in their financial holdings, and you addressed it well, I felt. Arnie, are there others from the auditorium? Jill, I know that Kent Hyman is trying to unmute, and he has.
I can unmute. I'm unmuted now, Ron.
Well, why don't you give your question while Arnie looks for others from the auditorium? Go ahead, Ken.
All right. Ray, thank you for a very interesting presentation. I have a question. If it was included in your presentation, I apologize. But while I have my own, I guess, bias in this subject, I really don't know the answer. So to ask the question narrowly, currently, are most divorces among couples that have children or are without children? And how might that compare to decades earlier? Thank you.
It's a good question. The data I've seen is that if a couple is going to get divorced, the average length of marriage is about 9 years. I have not seen the data on is that with or without children. My speculation is by being married 9 years, you're likely going to have at least one, if not two kids. So I think that, again, speculation, I'd have to research this, is that most people getting divorced are impacting children by that. But from the earlier charts I've showed, at least 40% of them are going to get remarried, and the children are going to be in households with two parents. But again, the number of one-parent versus two-parent households is declining. I'm sorry, number of one-parent households is increasing over time, both in all socioeconomic groups.
Right, and thank you. And the converse, or related question, I guess, which there's probably no data on, how many people remain in marriages that they otherwise might not because of the cohesive effect of children. So just.
Yeah, that's an excellent psychological question. And I think you'd have to go one by one, and you could probably accumulate some data. But look, I mean, relationships are powerful. Relationships can be conflictual. I think the issue, communication in relationships are very complicated, and people who are good at communicating and good at resolving issues tend to stay married. It is not that they have this blissful marriage deigned by God or some other power to last. It's that they've worked at it. And that's a psychological as well as a practical kind of trait.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. We have a couple more in the auditorium, and then I'll have one. By the way, we've been married 60 years in August, and I still don't have all the answers yet from you, Ray. So we will continue that. Auditorium, please finish up, and then I'll ask my last question.
Okay, mine is a comment. The way birth control changed, what we as women can do is incredible. In 1949.
Pat, if that's you,
Yeah.
we're having trouble with that auditorium microphone. You need to hold it about a foot from your mouth.
I'll do that. Birth control changed women's lives, I think, more than anything else. In 1949, a woman had to give up her teaching job when she got married because she might have children. In 1970, when I was teaching, I had to give up my teaching job because I was pregnant. Now, of course, they, have the baby right after school. But the opportunities it has given us, I, for one, went to med school in my 40s because I had those opportunities and I could be independent with, a salary then of my own.
Will you give us his email?
Get the email.
Could people have your email address?
We can't hear you, Arnie. You'd have to hold the mic further away.
Do people have your email address? Right?
They're asking for your ability to communicate with you by email. Do you want to share that or not? Or it's up to you.
I'd be happy to, Ron. It doesn't.
Okay,
we can-
just send it to Joe and then we'll have it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Anything else from the auditorium?
He's going to send. Hold on, one more question here.
Okay.
I have another lady. Hold on.
Hello. It used to be something like if you lived together for 7 years, it was almost like you were married, but that rule isn't around it. Common law, yeah.
Can I comment on that? I think she's referring to what's called palimony.
Common law marriage.
I'm sorry?
Common law marriage status in some states, if you lived together for 7 years plus, you would be considered married. I don't think that was in Illinois.
Right, but it wasn't universal. And so, yeah, there are legal issues involved in staying together where but I guess it's a matter of who has the most finances becomes responsible for the person who's in the less financially independent mode. Ron, can I mention something about your 60 years of marriage? Number one, congratulations. Number two, I'd like to give you just a little bit of data. 41% of married people get to 25 years. 8% get to 50 years. And you are among the 2% who get to 60 years. So congratulations.
I'll share that with Kate. I'll share that with Kate.
Yeah, congratulations on getting married young and living long. Okay.
Yes, thank you. Those are the two criteria, and having tolerance on both sides.
Well, can I share one thing for a long marriage? I've always believed that the best advice for a long marriage is you can absolutely think anything you want to think about your spouse, and you should absolutely not say anything you think about your spouse. Okay. It goes for
it
husbands.
takes 50 years to learn that. It's still a work in progress.
It goes for husbands and wives, right?
Last question, and has to do with kids. When you shared your information about kids, I'm thinking about the future and how America looks like it won't be able to do stuff, but it's not a political question in this regard. Do you feel that that younger people that are childbearing age are having fewer kids because it just makes sense to them, or do they feel beleaguered and feel that this is a world they don't want to raise kids in? And might that be a factor of if they felt better, would they have more kids, or would they have fewer kids if they felt better about things? How is that, find a question out of what I just said.
Yeah, I'm speculating, but I do think there's something about a feeling of pervasive pessimism about the future that deters people from having children. That unless you can feel optimistic about a world that you're going to leave your children to, it's hard to then adamantly want to create more children. And so we live in this world that is currently so divided, and we're exposed to so much social information and information about, kind of powerfully upsetting situations, that the impact on a 25-year-old or a 30-year-old or a 35-year-old can be, why do I want to leave my children in this kind of world? On so many factors, and it can be politically on the right, saying I don't want to leave my child in a world of moral degeneration. I don't want to have those children. And on the left, it can be I don't want to leave my kids in a world where their freedoms will be restricted or the climate will destroy us all. So those can be the two extremes. But religion has always produced children, and as long as I think that there are religious institutions and people who maintain themselves, we're going to have some population, but it's going to be diminished. It's going to be diminished. We see that today, and once again, that's why we get to the immigration issue, which has saved America in the past. And I think one's own view will be that it will either work or won't work for America in the future.
It's something for us to think about. Dr. Ray, we're going to share an email. Send me the email address you would like to share, and I'll send that to Jill and say that's the email address you would like to receive any comments from the audience that had. But I want to personally thank you. I've learned, I know the group has as well, and I want to turn it over to the auditorium.
And Ron, thank you and Jill for all the work you do to make this possible. So,
and Jill especially. Thank you, Jill.
And these conversations are combined. Everybody should know they're combined efforts. So
Right.
I do.
Dick, I'm turning it back to our president.
Well, I've got the microphone. This is Jill here. I can just hand it to Richard quickly. We're meeting in the middle.
Well, thank you very much for a very illuminating presentation. Just as a closing, as I was listening to everybody, I was thinking if somebody wants to take a trip back into the past, when I was in high school in the 50s, there was a novel. It was called Peyton Place. And it had a great description of things that went on then, and ask yourself what would happen in the current climate with the same scenario. And with that, we'll say thank you very much for your attention.